Welcome to the Right Take Podcast. News, ideas, and conversations at the intersection of politics and culture. A project of the David Horowitz Freedom Center. I will be your host, Mark Tapson. Greetings and welcome back to the Right Take Podcast. I am your host, Mark Tapson. On August 9th, 2001, this is just a month before the 9/11 attacks, a Jordanian woman named Alam Tamimi, disguised as a Jewish tourist, escorted a 22-year-old Palestinian male from Ramallah to Jerusalem and positioned him at the entrance to the Jerusalem branch of the Sbarro pizzeria chain just before 2 p.m., when the restaurant was filled with dozens of women, children, and babies, and pedestrian traffic outside was at its peak. Tamimi then slipped away to safety and got far away from the scene when the young Palestinian detonated either a rigged guitar case slung across his shoulder or a rigged belt containing explosives, nails, nuts, and bolts. 16 people were murdered, half of them children, as well as a pregnant woman, and 130 others were injured, many of them severely. Tamimi, who was a part-time newsreader at a Ramallah TV station, went straight to the station to report on the bombing which she herself perpetrated, along with others, of course. She had scouted Jerusalem several times that summer for a target rich in families and children before settling on the crowded pizzeria during school vacation. She was arrested, convicted, and sentenced to 16 life sentences in Israel. But in 2011, she was released along with over 1,000 other terrorists in the swap for IDF prisoner Gilad Shalit. Today, Alam Tamimi lives freely in Jordan. Not only has she expressed no remorse for this atrocity, to this day she has actually expressed delight over the bloodshed, the grief, and the horror which have made her celebrated as a heroine among Palestinians and Jordanians. She has hosted a TV show, addressed rallies, and appeared on social media bragging about the carnage for which she was responsible. In an interview in 2012, she talked about how Jerusalem Palestinians reacted immediately after the bombing. She said she was riding on a bus among them and, quote, "They were all smiling. You could sense that everybody was happy and congratulating each other. After hearing an initial report that 3 people were killed in the bombing," Tamimi said, "I admit that I was a bit disappointed because I had hoped for a larger toll. Yet when they said 3 dead, I said, Allah be praised. 2 minutes later, they said on the radio that the number had increased to 5. I wanted to hide my smile, but I just couldn't. Allah be praised. It was great. As the number of dead kept increasing, the passengers were applauding." Unquote. The passengers were applauding as the number of dead Israeli children increased. Let that sink in for a moment. Since 2017, Tamimi has been on the FBI's most wanted terrorist list, charged with terrorism. The Department of Justice offers a $5 million reward for her capture, but it's not like she's in hiding. We know where she is. But the Jordanians refuse to hand her over to us, despite the fact that since 1995 we have had an extradition treaty with Jordan. On the Right Take today, my guest is a man whose teenage daughter was killed in that Sbarro terror attack, a man who, along with his wife, has been seeking justice ever since. So stay tuned, you don't want to miss this conversation. And don't forget to subscribe to The Right Take so you don't miss any of the compelling conversations we're having here. Remember, if you like what you hear, please leave that positive review. My guest today at the intersection of politics and culture is Arnold Roth, the father of Malki Roth, a 15-year-old U.S. citizen who was killed in the aforementioned bombing of the Sbarro pizzeria in Jerusalem in 2001. Mr. Roth, welcome to the Right Take Podcast.
Thanks very much, Mark. I'm glad to be here.
Thank you for coming on, sir. First, let me offer you my deepest condolences. I have 5 children. I can only imagine that what you and your wife Frimet have been through is the worst nightmare a parent could ever experience. And I appreciate your willingness to talk about it with me and my listeners today. This August 9th, which is coming up in 2 months, will mark the 24th anniversary of your daughter's murder. In my opening remarks, I reminded people of the bare facts of that Sbarro terror attack and described briefly the injustice of the unrepentant Alam Tamimi's freedom. Can you please take us back to that day in 2001 and explain to listeners what happened in your own words from your perspective?
Well, my perspective is framed by my being at work. It was 2:00 in the afternoon. I was then running a drug development company in Jerusalem, where we live, where I'm speaking from. Got back from lunch with several of my colleagues, and there was a call from my wife, a frantic call. I won't go into the details of any aspects of this because it's probably not as impactful on others as it was on me, but it was hugely impactful on me. There's been a terrorist attack in the centre of town. I can't find the children. Click. She hung up the phone. Naturally, my role, and I went straight into it, was to call her back and say, look, you know how these things work. Don't get so agitated because it'll blow over. And many hours later, it of course had not blown over. We were unable to make any contact with Malki, who was a vivacious 15-year-old. We at first didn't know exactly where she was. I had left for work before she woke, and my wife was asleep when Malki let herself out of the house, coming by her bedroom and saying, Mummy, I'm going out with Michal, the girl next door, and I'll be in touch during the day. I love you. Bye. So we didn't know that she was, in fact, making her way, together with Michal, her closest friend, our next-door neighbour's daughter, through the centre of town from where we lived, which was in the northern half of Jerusalem, to the southern half of Jerusalem for a gathering of camp counsellors for the youth group that they were both part of. And we learned only hours after the atrocity was executed in the centre of Jerusalem that her plan, together with Michal, had been to go and grab a pizza. And that's all they needed to do to bring about what was very clearly the biggest catastrophe that we'd ever encountered. It took many hours, though. We didn't know for 12 hours, 12 full hours filled with prayer and anxiety of a kind that people can probably imagine, but they can't, before we discovered that Malki was in fact there and had in fact been murdered, and her two oldest brothers, by that stage accompanied by a social worker from the hospital, the last of the hospitals that we checked, had taken them to the pathology lab, the state pathology lab on the outskirts of Tel Aviv, and they identified their sister exactly 12 hours after the massacre had taken place, 2:00 in the morning. And Malki was buried the next day.
What would you like people to remember about your daughter?
I think the smartest thing always is to say that she was a sweet and lovable 15-year-old and leave it at that. But people who know me and who knew Malki also know that she was really very special, and that specialness manifests itself today in a charity that we set up in her memory. The reason we created a charity was she was just so good, and the good done in her own life had to be continued. Malki was number 4 in a family of 7 children. She was the middle child after 3 boys and before 3 girls. The youngest of our daughters was then and still is catastrophically disabled, and the life that the family lived and really continues to live, because our youngest daughter lives with us, has been very, very, very challenging. She's blind, she's brain damaged, lots of terrible things that make her in need of care around the clock. Malki got involved from the moment that we became aware of our youngest child's disabilities, above and beyond the call of duty, and many stories that I could tell about that. The upshot of it all is that she showed empathy and an understanding of what you need to do when you're a 15-year-old and you're in a school where there are some kids with special challenges that are mainstreamed in the school, what you need to do, what you can do to build bridges between them and the kids who are not so challenged. And she really distinguished herself in that way, but within our family it was much more than that. And then she was gone. And I have to tell you that one of the first things sitting in the mourning house, Jews have the practice of sitting for 7 days after a close family member's death and literally sitting on the floor and receiving guests and so on. One of the first things we did late at night was to sit and decide how we're going to remember Malki. And the end of that, and of course I'm skipping a lot of detail, is that we created the Malki Foundation. And that's now coming up to the beginning of its 25th year, and it does wonderful things. It reaches out, as Malki did, to families who have a very disabled child and does very practical things to ensure a better outcome than would otherwise be the case.
Well, that's excellent. How can people support the Malki Foundation?
Oh, so I'm very glad that you ask. What I would like to do is just give the website, and they'll be able to take it from there. It's www.kerenmalki, that's one word, KERENMALKI.org, O-R-G. Keren means foundation in Hebrew, and Malki was obviously her name.
Let's talk about Alam Tamimi, who was the perpetrator, or at least one of the perpetrators of this atrocity. She was actually convicted for her role in the attack and sentenced to 16 life sentences, but she was released in that controversial Gilad Shalit prisoner swap. What was and is your reaction to that swap in which over 1,000 terrorists, including Tamimi, were freed?
It's very clear in black and white, I'm sorry to say. It's not easy to have me at a dinner party, because if the issue comes up, I really am pretty determined in my view. And said it at the time. Nobody asked us, let that be clear. Nobody asked any of the families of the victims of the 1,027 convicted terrorists who were set free as the price for getting back Gilad Shalit. Fremit and I, my wife's name is Fremit and I, from the time the deal was announced until the deal was consummated, a period of about, I don't remember exactly, but about 60 hours, were furiously working the media, the English-speaking media. The Hebrew media wasn't that interested, but the foreign media gave us a lot of airtime because we were angry and upset, and we had a fairly touching story to tell. And our message was, this is going to be a disaster. This is not the way you deal with terrorists. The release here is precisely what Israel's greatest expert on the subject of how you deal with terrorists said you never do. That expert was Bibi Netanyahu, who wrote a book in 1996. I call it The Dummy's Guide to How You Deal with the Terrorists. That is not its real name. And he was the Prime Minister at the time of the Shalit deal. He is, of course, the Prime Minister today. I don't have political differences or any differences about anything with him, or for him or against him. But the towering catastrophe that the Shalit deal, in my eyes, was then, and has proven to be since then, with all of the unconscionable number of Israelis and others who were murdered by people who walked free in the Shalit deal, is an issue that's impossible to overlook. So I really have an uncompromising view about what you do with terrorists, and consequently these are not easy days, because as I don't need to tell you, we've got hostages being held by the terrorists for this very purpose, to make us do awful deals.
Yes. How do you think Israel should handle convicted terrorists and prisoner exchanges? Do you think that those exchanges benefit Israel at all?
It really depends on who I'm talking to. Not because I'll come to a different conclusion, but because I would dress it up a little differently so that people aren't too offended. But I'm going to take the liberty here of saying no good ever comes of dealing with terrorists, and it's a mistake. Netanyahu made it very clear in his book, and he was right, and unfortunately he did the exact opposite when he was first tested. But others have made the same kinds of mistakes. As a politician, and I've never been and never will be a politician, you face colossal pressures, and you don't always have a rational discussion with your constituency. In Israel it's even more complicated because, as you may know, the political culture here is based on coalitions. There's never been a majority government in the history of the State of Israel. Every government has been formed on the basis of a coalition. So you constantly, if you're a politician, and I'm not, did I already say that? I can't get along with politicians either. You're always looking over your shoulder to see who's coming to get you, who's got the knives out, what do I need to do in order to blunt that attack and keep going. So I don't envy them, but the principles here are really quite serious. You never get anywhere with dealing with terrorists because all they're interested in is not the outcome of the deal, but how much they can squeeze out of you before they make the same effort a little further down the track. And once they've done it, they're certain that they'll be able to do it again.
Has the Netanyahu government been helpful to you at all since the prisoner swap, or have they been no help in your pursuit of justice?
No help at all in the pursuit of justice.
And why do you think that is? Just politics, or why wouldn't they make more of an effort to make this situation right?
The question is a lot better, as you'll see, than the answer. And of course, it's the question that any intelligent observer at one stage or another is going to end up asking. Why is Israel not more helpful? Why is justice not treated with more respect? Why is this pursuit of justice in the specific case of this awful woman, Tamimi, gone on for so many years? And this isn't the format for an answer, unless you tell me, for a complicated answer, unless you tell me that we're going to go for 4 or 5 hours, because it really would be that sort of order of magnitude. But I would say, firstly, the role of Jordan is enshrined in a conception, and as you may know, conception is a word that's used a lot in Israel, and always in a negative way. Jordan is part of a specific conception which says we have a long border on the eastern side. We have a country on the other side which right now has its own soldiers positioned all along that border, and the direction of their guns is pointing at their own people. I've had that said to me by people at the very highest level of government and in various think tanks, and it was never true. It's only partially true, and it really isn't the point. I mean, here I don't want to get into an argument with myself or with you or with anybody else. It's a conception. There is this sense that Jordan has to be treated with kid gloves. There are other ways to say it. Nobody wants to annoy King Abdullah, and the word annoy is never ever in the sentence when I say it. Nobody wants to deal with King Abdullah and make him upset. And how detailed of a self-justification people will apply when running through that argument with me really depends on the circumstances, but to me it's completely bogus. We either believe in justice or we don't. We either believe that the terrorists have been sentenced by, in this case, the Israeli judiciary, to 16 terms of life imprisonment, and then when people ask us to treat those 16 terms as currency for the purchase of the life of a hostage, and only 8 years have run instead of the hundreds, then something is catastrophically wrong and you'll live to regret it. I don't know if politicians ever live to regret anything, but certainly those of us looking on deeply regret. This is not a universal view. At the time of the Shalit deal, the support for it ran at about 92% among Israelis. It wouldn't be anything near that today. But looking on, people seeing what is the gyrations that Israel went through and the hopes that accompanied it, and then stare into the face of what came next and what came afterwards, I don't believe any serious observer can make the argument that this was a smart thing to do. I, again, go back to what I just said a moment ago. I understand where politicians are. You've got families who are begging and threatening and enraged and protesting in the public places of the country, saying, we have to do everything we can to get back our loved ones. And of course, that's what they should be saying. But if you're the Prime Minister or senior figures in the government, you just can't take that view. You can't say, well, yes, we'll do anything. That was the expression that was used back in 2011, the Shalit deal. We have to do anything to get back Gilad. Well, that's simply not true. Had they asked for 16 Jewish virgins to be slaughtered in Kikar Rabin in Tel Aviv, the government would have said no. But the government said yes, 1,027 convicted terrorists, more than half of whom were murderers. But that, by the way, is a statistic that was never published, but I can attest to it because I did the calculations. That became a price worth paying. So here we are years later. I think that it was a mistake then. I'm sure it's a mistake today. And I don't have the political power to convey my views to the people who make these decisions. Maybe it's better that way.
You're not alone in thinking that, though. You mentioned that close to 90% or over 90% of the people of Israel supported that swap at the time, but since then that figure's been almost reversed, hasn't it? It's hugely unpopular in retrospect.
I think you're right.
Jordan and the United States have an extradition agreement dating back to the Clinton administration. Why is Jordan not honoring that agreement in this case, even though it's extradited other terrorists under this treaty? Why is Tamimi different?
Okay, every word in the sentence you just said is disputed, but you're absolutely right. You are absolutely right. There is a treaty. The treaty was brought into force in full compliance with the requirements on both sides. The treaty says that Jordan's left with no option once the United States fulfills its part of the treaty by formulating a request, delivering it to the Jordanian government. The only question, and here I'm being a little bit facetious, that Jordan can ask is, what plane do you want her to be on this afternoon? But that's not the way it's played out. And the people who I've challenged on the US side, and maybe I ought to make it explicit here, we've just made a switch. I no longer have anything to say to the government of Israel in order to get justice to bring to justice the murderer of my child. It's all with the United States. Israel walked away from it at the time of the Shalit deal. Right after the Shalit deal, in fact, no more than a month, I became aware that Tamimi, the monster, who had gone back to Jordan, which was her native land where she was born and grew up, was being given her own TV show. That was the trigger for me. I was just so enraged by that. It's hard to use those words because nobody takes it seriously. I was so enraged by the obscenity of her being given this kind of privilege and influence that I got on a plane to Washington, which I don't do every day, and a day later had a meeting with the top leadership of the FBI and the Department of Justice in the Washington office of the DOJ. And there, I can say, I had what remains until today the only interaction with senior figures in the United States government where the argument that she has to be brought to justice was understood and accepted and implemented. Every conversation I've had since then, most of them being with members of Congress or with the State Department or various highly placed officials, those discussions have been of a completely different kind. They've been one way. They've been the dialogue of the deaf and I'm not deaf. They were, and they are, conversations in which I say, well, Mark, you could repeat what you just asked me. Those very sentences. How can the United States have a treaty with a country that is wholly dependent on the United States for a long list of benefits, not least of them being income? It's the largest source of income for the sovereign Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan, US foreign aid. It's got a treaty where it's already handed over 3 terrorists over the years. No one batted an eyelid over that. That's all airbrushed out of the picture, I should tell you. Now it's denied, but it's not. It is true, and the evidence is it's there for anybody who wants to find it. And how, given that the United States is insisting that the treaty is on foot and Tamimi is a worthless wretch who should be brought to justice and not left to control the airwaves, filling Jordanian heads with visions of how beautiful it is to kill Jewish children, how can Jordan do what it's doing? And the answer is because they're being allowed to do it. There's never been a single confrontation, not one, between anybody on the United States government side or even any serious part of the United States media asking whoever it might be, the ambassador of Jordan to Washington, the king of Jordan in Washington, he comes at least once a year, often multiple times, anyone else of any similar stature. How do you do this? How do you dare to do this? So you have to understand, and this is the most painful part of any interview that I ever do, and I speak for my wife as well. She's not here in the room with me, but she'll agree. We are treated like babbling fools. No one ever engages with us in a serious way. There's a small exception, and we'll come to that, I think. But we are treated as if, well, pathetic people, let's just let them bark or howl, and then once they've gone, we'll just get on with things. And it's enraging. Without a doubt, and this is always a bad thing to say, I'm right, they're wrong.
So to your knowledge, no U.S. presidents have pressured Jordan about Tamimi.
Correct. That is true. On the other hand, there was a president or a presidential committee called Biden, where in 2022, after a long period of silence from the Biden office, as well as Blinken as the Secretary of State of the United States. Silence in the wake of an op-ed that we published in the Wall Street Journal and some other fairly prominent calls on the United States government. We got a response. We didn't expect it. It was months after the last attempt we had made, and that response was very concrete. It was a letter on State Department letterhead addressed personally to Frimmett and to me and delivered to our home, which said the Tamimi case is a foremost priority for the United States, and we will not rest, and we will keep you informed. And without sounding as if I'm trying to be sensationalist, every word that I've just said was a lie. So they never maintained any contact with us. The person who wrote it was the number 2 person in the State Department, writing in the names of Biden, Blinken, and the then head of the National Security Council, Jake something, I'm blanking. It's not a foremost priority. If it were, they would have done something. They had Abdullah in the White House and in the Congress at least 5 times during those Biden years. We're treated like idiots. And it's not as if we're asking, please make a postage stamp in memory of our child. We're talking about one of those fundamental concepts that generally people stand up and salute when they hear it. Justice is not to be trivialized. You don't play around with justice. And this is federal justice administered by the U.S. Attorney for Washington, D.C. The FBI is involved. Not only that, there's a $5 million reward for information leading to her arrest. And that's provided by the Rewards for Justice program, which happens to be in the State Department, not in the Department of Justice. So who's the babbling fool in this story? I don't think it's me. I don't think it's my wife.
I understand you and your wife met recently with the newly installed U.S. Ambassador to Israel, Mike Huckabee. How did that meeting go?
Let me first say that there have been ambassadors who have never responded to our requests for a meeting. One in particular was here for 4 years and ignored 12 requests. Others have met with us and left us feeling that we had just been totally patronized. Ambassador Huckabee responded, or his office responded, within a couple of days of our making the request by email to an anonymous service address at the American Embassy in Jerusalem, and our meeting came exactly a week after the request had been made. I have to say that I knew nothing at all about Ambassador Huckabee other than what the general, broad brush picture that's out there. But I found him to be gracious, thoughtful, attentive, interested in what we were saying, and responding in an intelligent way that indicated that there would be a follow-up. Now, we haven't gotten to the follow-up yet. The meeting that we had with him was on if I remember, the 13th of May, and there are some things that we agreed in conversation that he was going to pursue. But and I don't want to speak for him, but if I can summarize the atmosphere in the room, it was Ambassador Huckabee saying, I just don't get this. Let me make some inquiries. And those are words, I have to tell you, I've never heard from any official of any United States government.
I'll be eager to see if he follows up on that. And tell us about this petition that you've set up for U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio, which has nearly 30,000 signatures.
We started it before Secretary Rubio was the secretary, and we've rolled it over from secretary to secretary. And it says, in fairly straightforward terms, the United States must press Jordan to comply with its treaty obligations so that justice will be done. To me, that ought not to have any political character at all. In other words, what I was expecting and continue to expect at one part of my consciousness is that everybody on both sides of the aisle, and at the simplest level that means Democrats and Republicans, but it really means anyone who believes in anything, if they believe in the sanctity of human life and in the unacceptability of children being targeted for mass murder, which is what Tamimi did, and if the government of a country that has a treaty and receives several $1 billion of US funded aid each year, and has handed over every time they've been asked to hand over in the past, says, no, there's a technical problem, the United States government should put on its big boy pants and say, in a really stern voice, no, You know that's not right, and we know that's not right, and we'd like her to be handed over this afternoon. I'm not trying to be cute in anything that I'm saying. I think that what I just laid out is literally what ought to happen, minus the big boy pants. I don't know why not only Congress and not only the State Department and not only the American media, pretty much everybody in the picture allows Abdullah and his royal entourage, his retinue, which often includes the Crown Prince and the Queen, to come to Jordan and to have access to every committee in the Congress that is relevant to any of Jordan's interests, have free run of the place. I've never heard a single word of criticism. I've never heard the name of Tamimi mentioned. None of what's going on here can be rationalized unless you buy into the idea that there's this colossal conspiracy inside the Beltway where nobody will be allowed to annoy King Abdullah. And if that's true, that really ought to worry a lot of people. I'm not trying to worry people. My point in taking interviews like this one, which, Mark, I have to say I really appreciate, is to say, what would you do if your child had been murdered by a wretch who got arrested, who admitted to everything, who smiled, never wiped the smile from her face, and then had 5 years of running her own TV program in a country which doesn't have free TV. It's got a tightly controlled media. And then that country, which is a massive recipient of foreign aid, said to the United States, well, we actually don't want to comply with that treaty because we say it's invalid. So at the end, it's the question that I began with in this little segue. What would you do? What would anybody listening to this do? I don't know that anybody would do anything very different from what we're doing, which is like a dog with a bone. We're not letting go, and we're pushing even when we're obviously the unwelcome guests at the wedding, and we're doing it not out of a desire for vengeance or revenge, but because justice has not been done. And justice is a really powerful value for people like us, I'm guessing like you, where God fits into your outlook on what goes on in the world, and God definitely wants justice. God is the God of justice, and God is the God of love. And if we're ignoring all of this, and no one's even observing that we're ignoring all of this, including the media, something's gone really seriously wrong.
Where can people go to sign that petition?
www.change.org, change, change.org, /extradite Tamimi. Tamimi is spelled Tamimi.
Mr. Roth, the people behind your daughter's murder and the slaughter of so many others at Sbarro, the people behind the barbaric October 7 attacks, the people who are now murdering Jews on American soil, they belong to a death cult. You subscribe to a culture of life. Who is going to win?
Let me explain before I wade into the excellent question that Malki's younger sister lost her husband a year and a bit ago in Gaza, fighting against the very same Hamas forces. And that, in a very meaningful way, has personalized everything that I say and everything that we feel about the need for people, ordinary people like us, to draw a line in the sand and say there is right and there is wrong. And don't tell me about all the political niceties and about genocide and the things that you've invented in order to make your argument easier. There is a right and there's a wrong, and everybody knows that that's the case. So, the ethos, the values of Hamas and many other groups like them, but Hamas is the one we're talking about, are not a secret. They are inspired by a theological view of the world, which doesn't really have much interest in borders and settlements. Tamimi herself is a zealot. She's deeply caught up in the Islamist outlook on life and speaks about it often. I may not have made the point strongly enough. Tamimi's voice in Jordan has not been subdued or quietened, which is something that the Jordanian government has claimed again and again at public meetings that I've been given a report of. She is an effective voice for chaos extreme violence and profound lethal anti-Semitism. And Jordan has enough of those problems already. Jordan is one of the most anti-Semitic countries, as measured by the Anti-Defamation League, in the world, even in the Arab world. She represents something that everybody ought to understand about Hamas. They're not interested in a settlement. They're not interested in peaceful relations or working out crinks in the border. They're interested in destruction. Every action they take bespeaks a passion for victory. Victory is what it's all about. That's certainly what she's all about. And the constant repetition of Hamas leaders, religious leaders, secular leaders, who say, we cherish death and we'll win because the Israelis love life. And that, of course, that's a true statement, except for the part of who wins. The resilience of Israeli society. I live in Israel. I've been living in Israel since 1988. All of my children live in Israel. All of my grandchildren have been born in Israel. I'm a passionate Zionist. I understand Zionism in ways that the people who hate the Jews and hate the Zionists will never understand. We're here because we are redeeming the land and redeeming ourselves. We're making an Israeli population that was scattered throughout the world a people again, a people in a much more meaningful way. I'll say something else about my personal outlook on this and then leave it alone, because I'm not here to talk about my personal outlook. I'm from Australia, as people who are listening and wondering where my accent comes from might have noticed. My parents, like almost everybody in my cohort of young Jews in Australia, those of us born in the early 1950s, my parents were graduates of Auschwitz, both of them, and pretty much everybody that I knew in Melbourne growing up had no grandparents. Of course, that was the case for my family as well. No one had a grandparent. And the messages that we got being raised in a community which was overwhelmingly affected by the Holocaust, more than any other community on earth relative to the scale of the population, including Israel. Melbourne is unique in this respect. Everybody that I know was raised to hate, not to hate, but to get along, to make a productive life, to get a good education, to establish a family. Those were the values that were inculcated into us by parents who lost all of their everything that they could possibly have by the time they came to Australia as penniless refugees. They were intent on building a new life. When you have that kind of an education, and I certainly do, then what you're determined to do, even if there's a battle to get really key values carried forward, executed, justice in my case, it doesn't come at the cost of family and of loving relations. I'm looking at life now through the eyes of somebody who's 73 years old. In most people's book, that means I'm pretty much done and spent. But of course I'm not. I live a productive life and always have, and I see the same around me, my wife, my children, my grandchildren. We're here to do something useful and good. And if there are opportunities, for instance, through the Malki Foundation, Karen Malki, to do good that benefits other people, wonderful. And if it creates a connection in its goodness with the life of a child who was murdered in the cruelest possible way, one of 16 children murdered that day, one of 3 Americans murdered there in that Sbarro pizzeria, wonderful. That's really why we're here. Those are the values that we cherish. I don't see any parallel to that among the people who you and I are talking about now, really the enemy, the people who have ignited a war, the latest chapter of which began on the 7th of October 2023, an unforgettable and awful day. Those people didn't break into the huts and cabins and private homes in the south of Israel because they wanted to take control of them. They wanted to murder and pillage and rape. And they still want to murder and pillage and rape, and nobody ought to be left in any doubt about that. You don't win a war that way. What you do is you terrorize. And there's never been any doubt that that's what the Hamas people are all about. That's what their ethos is. That's what they teach their children to do, unbelievable as that may sound. So none of what I'm saying here means I hate anybody, let alone people in Gaza. I'm terrified of what they're doing, and I despise with every fibre of my body, the values that they project and that they inculcate into the next generation. I despise them. I don't hate these people. And if we have to kill them to stop them, of course we must. We must kill them. We must do whatever we can to preserve our society and our lives, because it was their side that brought this war upon themselves and upon us, and we must win. We have no option.
Yes, well said. Mr. Roth, could you repeat the website address of the Malki Foundation, and then where should people go on the internet to keep up with what you and your wife are doing and where you might be speaking and that sort of thing?
So the web address is www.kerenmalki, KERENMALKI.org, and it describes the work that we do, which I'm very proud of. We support families from every part of Israeli society. Roughly a third of all the families we support in its work over a period of 24 years now have come from the Arab part of Israeli society. And the most current kind of communications that we have are conveyed mostly, excuse the expression, through X.com. I know not everybody loves it, but I've been very caught up in creating content on what was once called Twitter and X, and so is my wife Frimet. And so our accounts are under our own names. One of them is called Arnold Roth, one word. Another one's called Frimet Roth, one word. And another one is called This Ongoing War. This Ongoing War is a blog that we started close to 20 years ago to really give expression to what it's like to live life after the murder of a child. And only years after that did it turn into what it's like to try to fight for justice for that murdered child. So justice is obviously a core value in what we write about, and it's also core to our lives.
Arnold Roth, thank you for sharing your story with the Right Take podcast. You and your wife are people of great courage and faith, and I pray for justice for your family.
Thank you so much. And they're prized words, precious. Thank you.
Listeners, thank you for joining us. Please do what you can to support Frimet and Arnold Roth's pursuit of justice against the ruthless perpetrator of a devastating terror attack. And don't forget to subscribe to The Right Take if you haven't already, so you don't miss any of the important conversations we're having here. And if you like what you hear, please leave a positive review. Thanks, and be seeing you. The Right Take with Mark Tapson is a project of the David Horowitz Freedom Center and Front Page Magazine. Unauthorized reproduction of this podcast without express written consent is prohibited.